Authors Over 50, Writing in Life's Sweetest Third. Authors Over 50's weekly podcast celebrates writers and their journeys to publication. Writing after 50 is a whole story on its own, so let's skip to life's sweetest third and talk with authors about their journey from pen to publish. Welcome, I'm Julia Daly, your host, and I invite you to listen to interviews with writers who've achieved their goal of publishing a book just later in life. We've seen award lists for under 30 or under 40, but I've yet to see lists for those who've achieved a significant milestone of their own, launching a new career and publishing their first book after the age of 50. We will hear about these authors' inspirations, struggles, strategies, and the smell of that first book. These writers' journeys inspire me because I'm one of them. My guest today is a writer, an artist, and a former therapist. She is the author of picture books for children, including a series called The Way I Feel. Her work has been translated into 10 languages and sold over 2 million copies worldwide. And now she has written a memoir, Missing. Welcome to Authors Over 50, Cornelia Spelman.
So nice to be with you. Thank you.
Cornelia, our opening question is always, so what took you so long to write your first book?
Well, it's a good question, Julia. And the answer is I always wrote. It just, nobody wanted to publish it till I was past, let's see, I think the first book I was 67. And I wasn't looking to publish, actually, but I was always writing. And mostly I've been writing a diary for 41 years, a daily diary. And I wanted to mention that because on my website, there's a link to the Schlesinger Library on the history of women in America. It's part of Harvard and Radcliffe. I didn't go there. That just happens to be where it's located. And they're interested in the diaries and the lives of ordinary American women. And so my diaries are there, closed until the year 2070. And my mother's diaries are there from when she was a teenager in Iowa, way back, because she was born in 1911. They have lots of diaries that are open for women to read, and lots of all kinds of things about American women. It's a wonderful resource that I never knew about till a number of years ago.
That is just so fascinating to me that you can go and read other people's work, and the fact that you have kept a diary, a daily diary, for that many years.
I think really, Julie, it's the most important writing I've done because I'm completely free, to write, because as I said, the diaries are closed. So I can say whatever I want without fear of hurting anybody. And as I'm sure you know, and as our listeners know, it helps so much to talk to somebody. And a diary is a way of talking. So I really like to advocate for women's writing. But you got to get a lock and key.
The only diary I ever had was under a lock and key when I was a teenager, and I certainly don't want that published anywhere.
Well, when you're dead and gone, you probably won't care, although, yeah.
Maybe not. I don't know if I want my great-grandchildren to read that.
Well, there's that.
Well, tell me about switching from a very successful career as a children's author to writing a memoir.
It's not unrelated. It's actually quite related because when I worked as a therapist, I loved working with children. And I also loved working with adults, mostly women, not surprisingly. And I discovered that a lot of people, especially children, but a lot of adults, didn't know what they were feeling. They didn't know how to name it. They sometimes didn't even know. If I'd say, well, how do you feel about that? They'd say, I don't know. I don't know. I have an upset stomach. And of course, a lot of times our bodies tell us what we're feeling. So I got the idea back then to write books for very young children, partly because we need to learn it early. And to write books about feelings. And the reason it's so related to my memoir is because my mother had a great catastrophe happen to her when she was 7 years old. Her father suddenly died. And her father was, I think, what you might call the psychological parent. He was very warm, very loving. I gather I'm making all this up in some ways because I only have certain evidence, right? He died in 1918, so clearly I never met him, and my mother was only 7. But she didn't have anybody to help her. You know, the times were different then. And her mother, from what I can see, was very cold. Now, I know she might well have been terribly affected herself by her husband's death. She was a young woman, but she was cold to all of us. I mean, I only met her 4 times in my whole life, and she lived till I was 21. And I was named in her honor. Her name was Corny, not Cornelia. I still don't know why it was just Corny, but I wish that my mother could have these books. I wish that my mother especially could have had When I Feel Sad, and that she would have learned, because I don't think she did, that she would have learned that it was helpful to share your feelings and to acknowledge them. Because I think, like many women of her generation, she thought she shouldn't have certain feelings, and she shouldn't share them, especially not those uncomfortable feelings of anger, jealousy, fear, even sadness. And I actually think that my mother smoked herself to death, which she did at the age of 63, because she could not express her feelings. And, you know, when we don't feel connected to other people, I believe that's what addiction is about. It's also a physical thing, clearly. Alcoholism and nicotinism, you could call it, a smoking addiction, is a very definite physical problem too, and often genetic, alcoholism at least. But also people turn to substances when they can't turn to other people. And so there's quite a connection between my children's books and the memoir.
Well, I think that is just vital today, not only for our children, but for all of us, because there are so many of us who cannot express our feelings and we don't know how we're feeling or how to express that those feelings to others. I think your books are just so important.
I appreciate that. And I have found that a lot of teenagers read them too, because they're kind of like emotions 101. And, you know, our emotions give us so much important information. They're not, it's like not looking at the dashboard of your car when you're driving. I need to know how I feel, and not only how I feel, what do I do when I feel this way? That's an important part of my books for the children. When I feel angry, this is what it feels like in my body. And then this is what I can do. I can have all the feelings I want. There's nothing wrong with the feelings, but I cannot act on those feelings. I cannot hurt people. I cannot throw things. I still have to pick up my toys. I can be angry and I can say I'm angry, but that's different from being hateful. And boy, don't we need to know the difference today.
There are a lot of people, even though you have sold 2 million copies, there are a lot of people who didn't read those books and cannot express themselves in their relationships to each other.
Right. And it's interesting to me that the books have sold in other languages because not all the countries have bought the same books. Some cultures seem to avoid certain topics, but most of them, the whole series, which is 8 books, have been translated. And it's a strange feeling, as you can imagine, a wonderful feeling to think that there are children in China who are being read, since most of the books are for very little children, reading those books. And I'm sure that their parents, like us, really need to know that information as much as the children do.
Well, Cornelia, what do you contribute the 2 million sales to? Was it publicity? Was it your publishing house? What helped to garner those sales?
Well, of course, the publishers had to find agents in foreign countries and know enough to do that. But it's kind of an unusual story because I never had an agent. I never did any particular publicity. But the publishing house was one that was well known for books about certain topics to help children. And so they managed to make those connections. I attribute it, Julia, to the fact that the books were so needed, that they met such a need, and they were among the first books to do that, especially When I Feel Angry, which, not surprisingly, is the biggest seller of that series. Although I do have a couple other books that are not in this series. One, Your Body Belongs to You, which is also a very big seller because, of course, that's something universal that we need to teach our children in all cultures also. So I think it's mostly the need and not publicity.
Well, that is just so amazing to me because we're told that more than 1 million books are printed, titles are printed in the US every year, and how our writers can ever, find a way to make their book known is really important to try to figure out.
Well, they were sold, some of them became scholastic books. The publisher knew connections with schools. That's one of the ways, but and also it happened over a period of many years. I mean, the first book I wrote in 1998 of that series, so it's been 20 some years that they've been out there and accumulating those sales.
Well, it is quite inspiring.
Thank you. Yeah, it's inspiring in the sense of feeling you can make a difference. And I like to think of, my little mother at 7, having had this as kind of a harvest of what happened to her, that all these children are able to learn more. And of course, there's been a cultural change too, because our own culture became very interested in what they call social emotional health. And so it was partly luck, and timing that I happened to want to write those at the same time, or I didn't even know that was going to happen, really.
Well, I know you write in your diary every day. Do you do any other writing? What is your writing routine? Are you a morning person or a night person?
I'm a morning person. Probably when I was younger, I was a night person, but once I had children, forget that. I love getting up early, often at 5 o'clock. And the first thing I do is make a cup of tea. I used to make a pot of tea. Now it's a cup because a pot is a bit too much. And sit down and start to write. And Julia, the other thing that's funny is I write it because I write partly because I love using fountain pens. If I didn't have a diary, what could I possibly use my fountain pen for, right? Because nobody writes. When I was in the 4th grade, you were allowed to get your first fountain pen. I got an Esterbrook, but we weren't allowed to use turquoise ink, And my grandmother, Corny, who I was talking about, actually was a teacher of handwriting in Iowa back in the long ago past, 1905. She had lovely handwriting. My mother had lovely handwriting. My husband tells me my handwriting is very pretty. My daughter has nice handwriting. I don't know if my granddaughter will, but it's so much of a pleasure to me to write with a fountain pen and different colored inks, including turquoise. Now that I'm old, I can use whatever color ink I want. And I use very lovely paper. I use Clairefontaine notebooks, which is a French notebook maker, though they're for sale, online. And it's a non-permeable paper, so the ink, doesn't go through. And it's also satisfies some artistic urge, simply making those marks on paper. But I think on paper and I talk to it. Do you write a diary?
I don't keep a diary, but I love anything in print. So I have lots of note cards and I write thank you notes. Um, my children will say, "Mother, just send an email," and I'll say, "No, that's not the same." You know,
Right.
my mother would
That's
be
the only
rolling
thing you
over in
can
her
do.
grave if she thought I didn't send a proper thank you note.
Yeah.
So yes, I love a pen on paper.
I was so interested that you wrote this book about adoption and that you were adopted yourself, because
Mhm.
I worked when I was a social worker, I worked in adoption and adoption reform and got terrifically interested and involved in it because, speaking of feelings, as you well know, all three parties to an adoption have so many feelings, and they're not, in the old days, they were not cared for. And so many of the women of my generation, really, I'm 76, so many of those women gave up their babies before they knew what on earth they were doing. They were not counseled properly. So,
Yeah.
and I know some of the difficulties and challenges of being an adopted person, even though I'm not adopted myself, nor did I give up a baby for adoption. But I I'm very interested in that topic, and I wonder if you'd like to tell more. Well, I'm sorry, maybe you don't want to now, but about having found your birth mother, because this issue, this feeling, this relationship that I'm writing about in my memoir is so related to being adopted in a way, because it's about the loss, the longing for a mother, loving a mother, but losing a mother. And you had two, and you can't help but wonder, you know, what your blood mother, your first mother, as I've heard it called, your first mother was like, and your second mother. And I've talked with so many adoptees who have had both good and not good reunions.
Well, you know, my favorite thing about writing my first book, No Names to Be Given, was the fact that so many people, so many adoptees, so many adoptive parents, so many birth parents have reached out to me and told me their stories. And that has been just, you know, such an honor to be able to listen to their stories and share my own. So that was my favorite part about writing that book.
I'm glad you did.
What about publicity for this new book? You're not publicizing children's books, you're publicizing a memoir. Can you tell us about any challenges as far as publishing or publicity that's worked or hasn't worked for you?
Well, this is the first time I've ever hired someone, and she's just wonderful. And it's made such a difference. Whether or not it will make a difference in book sales, I don't know, and I don't care really. What I care about is being able to have these conversations like I'm having with you. And she and I talked a little bit in the beginning about what to do, what I wanted to do for the book. I said, just let me talk to people. That's what I want to do. It's so it's not like a memoir that it's not like a book, I should say, that's maybe fiction. It's true. It's my own story. It's of the deepest importance to me still, even though all those people are gone. And I know that so many readers, so many listeners have stories of their own in their families, perhaps not mine, hopefully not with a brother that disappears, but stories about that their mothers may not have told them. My mother never talked to me about her father's death, for instance, and yet I believe that was the pivotal event that set her on a course for the rest of her life. And all of us have those stories in our family. And I think we need to find out about them so that we understand where we come from and how these things affected us, because what affected our mothers affected us. And that's what affected our grandmothers, affected us. Our fathers too, of course, but I tend to think more in the maternal line because it's mostly the women who've passed on these kinds of what I call emotional legacies to the next generation.
And as children, we never thought that our mothers were children or teenagers or had lives before us. We just always thought that they were mothers. So it's interesting to delve back into those past and to really get to know who those women were who are related to us.
Oh, definitely. And I was so lucky to have found these 3 diaries of my mother's, only kept, for a short period of time, as young people tend to do. And if I can read you one of her entries.
Sure.
This is from 1927. So she was 16. Sunday again. And a simply perfect day with my Nathan, of course. Sunday school and church in the morning. This is Iowa, 1927. Breakfast, and then Nathan, a good movie, chow mein with mother, and Nate up to Riley's and home. Oh, he's a sweet thing, and I love him so, and I love life, and everything's beautiful.
Wow. She was in a really good place then.
She was in a really good place. And, this is her picture on the cover when she was 16, when she wrote that. And I wrote the book to try to understand what happened to this beautiful and happy and full of life girl. What happened that she turned out to have smoked herself to death at 63 and to end up in such a sad way?
I know. I think the loss of hope for anyone is what is most tragic in life. You see these young people and they seem so full of life and joy and expectations, and then something happens along the way, and when you lose hope, it seems like it's just a tragic end.
I think that's an important point, and one unfortunately so relevant today with so much sadness going on and so much hateful behavior and so much fear, violence.
Yes. Well, tell us about the memoir a little bit, where you're going to read for us today so that we can hear your tone and voice in the book.
Okay. Well, the main story is about what happened to my mother. And I begin it by going back and meeting someone that she was friends with when she was just a little bit older than this picture. And that was a man named William Maxwell, who was 76 at the time. I thought he was so old. Now I'm 76. And he had known my parents when he was very young, and they were very young at the University of Illinois. And he went on and had a very unusual and stellar literary career. He was the fiction editor at the New Yorker magazine for many, many years. I had not ever been in touch with him, but my husband had an opportunity to meet with him. And so I said, tell him that you're married to Norman and Elizabeth Spelman's daughter. And so we got an invitation to tea at his apartment in New York City. And I really had hardly ever been to New York at that point. Well, it was lovely to meet him. And he remembered my parents. He remembered my mother when she was young, and my father, who he liked very much. And he could see their faces in my face. And so he was fond of me, and I was fond of him. And he was sort of like a father to me. And we wrote for a period of years. And I told him, as I was thinking about this book and I was writing it, I told him about what had happened to my mother. And he said, I hope you'll tell your mother's story. I think it will help make it up to her for what happened to her. And he didn't live long enough to read it, but he read parts of it. And so I thought that I would read a little bit, if I could, from that first meeting with him, Bill, this is at the end of our tea party. Bill's tea was excellent, smoky and delicate. I'd never tasted tea like it. He was impeccably courteous, and in his presence, I wanted to be equally polite. So, although I wished to talk with him longer, after an hour, I felt we should go. He helped me on with my coat. I wished to embrace him, but for some reason I held back. I hope I will see you again, he said to me at the door, and then closed it, extinguishing suddenly the lovely light from his clean windows. Although I visited Bill and his wife Emmy in New York only a few more times over the years, I wrote to him, sharing my thoughts and feelings about Mother and Pop and about my own life, sometimes sending along brief excerpts from Mother's diaries or letters, because I was trying to understand and write about what had happened to that girl he had described as vivid. With his perfect courtesy, he always replied. I wondered later if I'd ended up asking more of him than he'd bargained for when he invited us to tea. But he had written to me, quote, "Only connect," Mr. Forster said. And this we have never failed to do. And as an inscription in one of his books, he wrote, "For Cornelia Spelman, whom I loved at first sight." His affection emboldened me to imagine him as the parent, both father and mother, I wished I'd had, and to turn to him at times for guidance. His two daughters, years after his death, when asked what he was like as a father, spoke of their disappointments. But as his wife Emmy once said to me during a visit, when I was telling them about my parents' feelings, sometimes people make great friends, but not great parents.
That was lovely. I think that is a perfect place to end there. And I just enjoyed our visit so much today. Everything that you've shared with us has been lovely. And I want to let you know that our last interview question is always, our writers over 50 are quite a unique set. Do you have any advice for writers 50 and above?
I do. Write because you love it. Write because you love it. And don't worry about whether or not you ever get published. If you do, that's nice, but that's not the point, really.
I think that's great advice. And I'm just so happy to have had this visit with you today. And I look forward to more of your work and to buying those children's books for my granddaughter, who is a voracious reader and very in touch with her feelings. But I think that you'll be able to help her even more with your writing. So thank you so much for that. And we're happy to say that you're now one of our authors over 50.
Thank you, Julia.
Thank you for joining us today. Please look for Authors Over 50 every Thursday, when we will have conversations with accomplished debut novelists over the age of 50. Please subscribe and share with a friend. And check out my own publication journey after 50 at www.juliadaily, that's DAILY, like dailynewspaper.com. Until next time, keep reading and writing. And remember, it's never too late to fulfill a dream in life's sweetest third.